Hello, so my name's Niheer Dasandi. I work with the DLP at University College London, and the research I'm going to talk about is research I'm doing with David Hudson. So the way that this research came about was myself, David, and another colleague of ours, Karen Pfeiffer, were interested in reform processes around the private sector and how this kind of political bureaucratic interactions and how this kind of change happens. And we spoke to Tom Parks, and he suggested we work with a DFAT funded project through the ADB, which was called the Mekong Business Initiative, which was working on private sector reform in Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia and Vietnam. And actually it was a conversation with them that led us to look at telecoms, because one of the things that they were really interested in is understanding how change could happen in Myanmar, and the case that they highlighted was of the telecom sector in Myanmar. So to give a bit of context, in 2011, Myanmar, along with North Korea, had the worst kind of mobile phone and internet penetration rates in the world. So less than 1% of the population had access to the internet or to mobile phones. And now in 2016, it's in terms of SIM cards per capita, so penetration rates, it's up to around 75%. So in the space of a few years, you've seen this incredible transformation. The impacts in terms of development potential are well known in terms of what it means for people to have access to digital technology and this kind of information. But one of the things that I think I would have forgotten or not been aware of had I not spoken to people about the work we're doing is actually at the individual level. There's something incredibly empowering about access to that kind of technology when you're talking about a context where information and communication has been controlled so heavily. So it's not a luxury device, it's something that people value very deeply, that this sense of being able to communicate freely. So this is the change that we've looked at. So a huge transformation in the sector, and so we were interested in the politics around how that transition happened, how that transformation happened. So the reform involved kind of two processes that went on simultaneously. So the first was a partial liberalisation of the telecom market. So the situation was you had a state-run enterprise called Myanmar Post and Telecoms. So MPT previously was running the sector. And you've now had partial liberalisation where you have two international companies, so Telenor from Norway, Ooredoo from Qatar, who are now providing SIM cards and infrastructure for mobile technology. At the same time, you've had so there was no real regulation in the country because it was all state-run. So you've had the introduction of a law for the telecom sector and a framework to kind of govern the telecom sector. So that's the change that's happened. And on the surface, it may not seem so impressive because we've seen this in a lot of countries, this transition. But it's the nature. So this process has been praised very heavily for its transparency, the way in which this has happened. And B, it's the obstacles that were faced in Myanmar at the time. So the obstacles, I'll go through the 6 kind of broad obstacles that we found. So first, just within government, you're talking, I'm sure many of you realise the situation in terms of the military government, this transition, a lot of resistance within the Myanmar government to transition, to kind of open up the market and to release that control. Especially as they were getting a couple of $100 million a year in government revenue through the telecom sector, despite how weak it seems on the outside, but still an important source of revenue. Secondly, just a context of really high uncertainty. So no one really knew so the government had talked about reform, no one knew if they were serious about reform. In terms of laws, there's huge changes going on. One of the big issues is land rights and land tenure. So not much known about land laws in terms of, and this had a huge impact in building the infrastructure. How do you address a context where it's not clear who owns what land? How do you build the mobile phone towers that are needed? Thirdly, a complete absence of bureaucratic capacity. Again, it's come from a kind of military dictatorship where very little kind of what we would see as a kind of technical or an independent bureaucracy to kind of engage in policy making. Fourth, I'm sure many of you are aware of this big issue of kind of cronyism in Myanmar. So a lot of companies that are listed on kind of international sanctions list, linked with various military figures, who are very powerful in the economic sector now. So there's huge kind of vested interest and huge kind of potential for elite capture within the telecom sector. And then the last two, one was an issue of surveillance. So Human Rights Watch released a report saying effectively there's huge potential here for what seems to be a government put in place by the military, to now be engaged in surveillance if this telecoms reform goes ahead. And finally, around this time, you saw this rise in a kind of nationalist movement in Myanmar, particularly kind of very anti-Muslim movement, which had huge implications when Ooredoo was awarded the second license. So those are the obstacles that happened. So in terms of then understanding how and I should say, just as Suna said, I wouldn't call it a success story in that seems to define it as everything's finished. It's positive in that there's been huge positive change, but there are huge issues that remain in the sector and more generally. So how did this happen? So when Sarah kind of mentioned issues of complexity, so we've kind of thought about this in terms of complexity, and what we mean very simply is that there are multiple paths towards this change happening. So we feel that you need to take into account, so on the one level there's the political change going on in Myanmar at the time. So this reform would not have been possible were there not a bigger, much deeper kind of political transition happening in the country. Secondly, there's the international context, which often gets ignored in a lot of the discussions around kind of politics of developing countries. It's very inward-looking. Here there's a context where you're working with donors, but also with international companies that are now coming into the country. This brings huge kind of issues. In this context, it was largely positive in that there was this narrative created around Myanmar, which was it's kind of rejoining the global economy, and it's being brought in. So there was extra attention given by the donors, particularly the World Bank in this context, and also it was seen as a huge untapped market for the telecoms companies. In another reform that we're looking at, there's a real negative of that kind of notion of untapped market, and we can go in and do whatever we want. So in this case, it was positive, but it also involves then trade-offs that are brought in with that. So we tend to think a lot about the need for kind of local contextualization of reform processes of these changes, but there's a trade-off, because at the same time, when you've got these international players joining who are used to international best practices, it's a really difficult thing to balance that local and that international, which comes up in this reform. And then finally, the other area that was really important was sector characteristics. So Claire McLaughlin, our colleague at DLP, has done a lot of work around the politics of sector characteristics. And effectively in telecoms, you have huge investment costs up front, so not anyone can go in and set up a company. It was seen as a very high impact reform. It was one that people were waiting for, so it was very visible as a reform. And so these kind of three features then shaped the way in which the reform unfolded. So it kind of led to this reform taking on having its own dynamics and characteristics. It took on very special significance because reformists around the president managed to convince him that this was really a low-hanging fruit, that this would be a good reform to start with to show the world that Myanmar was ready for business, as the much kind of coined phrase. And so it became seen as this flagship reform which gave them extra space to the reformists, and had kind of various other kind of links to this, which I'll talk about. So it also meant that the World Bank, who had so there was an ICT specialist from the World Bank that worked with the government. She was given, so her name's Tenzin Norbu, she was given a huge amounts of leeway by the World Bank, so it was a case of make sure you get this reform done well, work with them as much as you need to, which isn't always the case. Well, it's generally not the case with this type of international local partnership. So it also had impacts for the reform team, the selection of the reform team itself. So particularly important was U Thong Tin, who's now the Deputy Minister of Telecoms. So he's an individual that's not been part of the political bureaucratic structure in Myanmar. He's been brought in from the outside, from academia and business, which again brought with it, so it kind of addressed those issues of lack of bureaucratic expertise. You had someone that was brought in from outside. The role of political leadership, again, really important. It was picked as this kind of flagship reform, and you see leadership coming into it a lot. So there was a lot of efforts to elite capture, which I won't talk about, but it played out very publicly. So in the remaining time, just to talk about some of the lessons, and I know I haven't given you that much detail on the reform itself, but some of the lessons. So these multiple paths, understanding these are really important. So one of the reasons why they're so important is because the actors involved recognised that these changes were happening. They recognised that they were given extra space, and they managed to convince the government effectively why the reform was such a good idea, and the way in which the reform unfolded. It also meant they were able to change the narrative around it. So from this notion of kind of winners and losers, which was a big fear for a lot of local companies. They managed to kind of convince them up front that they'd be part of the supply chain of the telecom sector, which again eased some of the opposition to the reform. Broadly speaking, a big issue here is with ideas transfers. So one of the things that when you speak to those involved and those around it, so civil society groups, it was a very close relationship between the World Bank, so Tenzin Norbu and the reform team. And it kind of highlights a real difference in the way. So she's a technical expert, and one of the interesting things is she really recognised the limits of her knowledge that she was bringing to the context, which is she knows about the technical components, she has experience from other contexts, and so she kind of presented these as, here are the trade-offs involved in all of the cases I've worked in previously. She brought in bureaucrats from other countries who had been involved in similar processes to explain effectively, this is what worked for us, this is what didn't work for us. And she herself was actually, she's from Bhutan and was part of the reform process in Bhutan in telecom. So one of the things that kind of gets missed a bit, so we tend to talk about, within this kind of political space in development, we tend to talk about kind of development entrepreneurs, mavericks, or deviants, which I think means different things to different people. But one of the things that really comes out of it is this notion of empathy, which I think is often lacking. That it's not about coming in, and it's a really basic message that we've heard throughout today. But the ability to kind of recognise the difficult circumstances that her partners were in from the World Bank point of view, and the ability to recognise what the World Bank was bringing, I think was a really important part to this reform process. And finally, the other issue around ideas is this kind of notion of trade-offs. There's a bit more to be said about ideas. So in particular, the two kind of political leaders, the minister and the president, formerly of the military regime. So Mark Blythe has done a lot of work on how these kind of critical junctures open up spaces for people to change identities. And again, this is something that I feel like PEA and thinking working politically tends to ignore. Finally, this kind of very basic message, which again in this kind of slightly Machiavellian view of politics sometimes gets missed, which was one of the big things that saved this reform all the way through, because they did face a lot of obstacles, was the transparency of the process. So that transparency meant each time they ran into hurdles, very publicly reported on, the media kind of reported heavily on this, they were able to say, this is our criteria, this is how we've selected companies, and we're going by the book. And that transparency in itself saved the reform. So this focus on kind of means and ends, and often there's this view that we focus on the ends and the means don't matter. We're actually here, what you see is bringing the public in. This focus on transparency was really key to kind of reform success, and I will leave it there. So thank you very much.